Giants in Magic the Gathering are a creature type dating back to the first set and appear on over 200 cards. While Giants are predominantly seen in red, the creature type is represented in every color and has seen a wide variety of effects printed on its members. While sets like Lorwyn and Kaldheim put focus on Giants playing together as a cohesive archetype, in practice, Giants have found one-off homes in other decks and strategies unrelated to the Giant creature type. That said, throughout Magic's history, it has seen multiple Giants that have had competitive impact on the game. And today we'll be going over 10 of the best Giants in Magic the Gathering, with today's video narrated by guest voice actor Hardleg.
Coming in at number 10, we have Boonweaver Giant. This creature costs 6 generic mana plus 1 white mana for a giant monk with 4 power and toughness. When Boonweaver Giant enters the battlefield, it allows you to search your graveyard, hand, or library for an aura card, then attach it to Boonweaver Giant. While there are plenty of auras in Magic that Boonweaver Giant could potentially search, generally speaking, in competitive play, the only one it tends to search is Pattern of Rebirth. This aura's effect is that whenever the creature it is enchanting dies, its controller may search their library for a creature card and put it onto the battlefield. Essentially, this means that whenever the Boonweaver Giant now dies, you're allowed to replace it with any creature of your choosing from your deck. As a 4-mana spell, Pattern of Rebirth generally doesn't see much play in fair decks, since there are much faster and more efficient ways to cheat out creatures. However, when used with Boonweaver Giant, not only is Pattern of Rebirth now free, it becomes repeatable as well. By using the Pattern of Rebirth effect to search a card like Karmic Guide, you may then use the Karmic Guide's effect to bring back the Boonweaver Giant, who in turn can search another copy of Pattern of Rebirth, or even the same copy that is now in the graveyard. From there you can search up Revilark to revive the Karmic Guide, and, with the help of a repeatable way to sacrifice your own creatures, you now have an infinite loop. Blood Artist, or similar life-draining cards, provide you with the inevitable win condition. Of course, this combo is far from ideal. Seeing as how Boonweaver Giant cost a total of 7 mana, it can be difficult to get out without cheating it out. And in competitive formats, there are usually far stronger threats to cheat out through other means. Boonweaver Giant saw most success in competitive pools from the Commander format. But with time, even Commander has moved away from Boonweaver Giant. For a time, it was one of the premier cards in a potent combo deck, and its legacy is such that it is enough for the bottom spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Cragganwick Cremator. Hailing from Shadowmoor, Cragganwick Cremator costs 2 generic and 2 red mana, and has 5 power and 4 toughness. This giant shaman makes you discard a card at random when it enters the battlefield. If the card discarded this way was a creature card, Cragganwick Cremator deals damage equal to the card's power to target player or planeswalker. Essentially, Cragganwick Cremator represents a ton of potential burn damage, assuming an appropriately built deck and a bit of luck. Some red-green aggro decks historically use Cremator to help push for damage. It has fairly good stats for a 4-mana value creature, and its ability can potentially shave a large amount of life from the opponent. Generally, these Cragganwick Cremator decks would play a more conventional aggro deck, leveraging Ghalta Primal Hunger as the deck's only major source of burn damage aside from Cragganwick Cremator, since Ghalta's high mana value could be offset to make the card actually castable. Beyond that, these aggressive versions simply run the most aggressively statted creatures they can, such as the 3-mana value Steel Leaf Champion, whose 5 power is useful either on the board attacking or when discarded to Cragganwick Cremator. Other decks built around Cragganwick go more all-in, running high-power spells not even intended to be cast, in hopes of discarding one of them and dealing massive amounts of damage. Worldspine Worm not only does 15 damage when discarded, but it also shuffles itself back into the library whenever it's put into the graveyard, meaning that in these builds, the discard fodder can even be reused. That, however, doesn't make Cragganwick Cremator much more viable. The deck has seen very little in the way of competitive events, and even fewer actual tops. The deck has remained a rogue option ever since first coming to be, however, seeing as how it is built entirely around Cragganwick Cremator, and would not function without him conceptually. The cards ahead of him on this list, however, either saw wider play in their time, or actively still see play to this day. Then at number 8 we have Beabstalk Giant. As a creature, Beabstalk Giant is remarkably simple. For 6 generic and 1 green mana, you get a giant whose power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control. However, this is only half of Beabstalk Giant as a card, since it is an adventure card. Adventure spells are a subtype of instant and sorcery that are attached to a creature or artifact card. In this case, while you could cast Beabstalk Giant for 7 mana and get the creature, you could also instead cast the adventure sorcery Fertile Footsteps. For 2 generic and 1 green mana, you may search your library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield. After casting an adventure spell this way, instead of it going to the graveyard, you exile the card, and are then allowed to cast the creature portion of Beabstalk Giant as if it were still in your hand. This completely changes Beabstalk Giant from being a somewhat underwhelming body into both ramp and payoff. While rampant growth effects have been printed at 2 mana before, Beabstalk Giant only costs 1 more and provides you with a larger body in the late game. This alone isn't enough for decks to want to run Beabstalk Giant, but alongside other adventure support, the Giant suddenly becomes much more effective. Lucky Clover copies adventure instants and sorceries whenever you cast them, meaning that Fertile Footsteps now searches 2 lands. Adventure decks in Standard were potent enough that Lucky Clover was eventually banned. Today, Historic and Pioneer still sees adventure decks running the likes of Beabstalk Giant, albeit they're not exactly meta options given the variety of other strong decks in those formats. But despite not being as relevant as it once was in Standard, Beabstalk Giant's mana ramp, coupled with a scaling late-game threat, means that for decks eager to run adventure spells, Beabstalk Giant is one of the easiest inclusions. And for the number 7th spot on this list, we have Lotleth Giant. This zombie giant has 6 power, 5 toughness, and costs 6 generic and 1 black mana. When Lotleth Giant enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to target opponent for each creature in your graveyard. At surface level, this seems like a fairly unassuming card for graveyard decks in Limited, given its high mana value and underwhelming on-paper ability. While it's natural for some creatures to be in your graveyard by the time you have enough mana to cast Lotleth Giant, the few points of damage there are hardly worth running the giant by itself. However, with a deck focused on putting creatures into the graveyard, suddenly this card has a bit more wiggle room. Legacy Dredge decks aim to mill as much of their deck into the graveyard as they can. The way these decks work is by milling a large number of cards in hopes of milling a creature that can bring itself back from the graveyard, like Icarid. Most of these recursive abilities are conditional, meaning that often several creatures can be left sitting in the graveyard to pump the damage Lotleth Giant deals. And Dredge doesn't even actively aim to cast Lotleth Giant either. Given that the deck is so efficient at both milling cards and recurring its creatures, the card Dread Return allows the Dredge player to reanimate Lotleth Giant without paying any mana, as long as Dread Return is in the graveyard. If it is, you can instead sacrifice 3 creatures to pay the cost of Dread Return, and then not only bring back Lotleth Giant, but add 3 more damage in the process by sacrificing those creatures. In a deck like Dredge, it's often that Lotleth Troll can do damage upwards of half of someone's total life, just by entering the battlefield. Combined with the aggressive creatures that the deck runs and other forms of burn via Creeping Chill, Lotleth Giant has become a tech choice for Legacy Dredge decks looking for a bit more explosive power. To this day, Dredge decks still run the card, albeit usually at only 1 or 2 copies, as you never actually want to draw it, and instead want to mill it and reanimate it with Dread Return. Coming in at number 6, we have Doomwake Giant. This enchantment creature costs 4 generic and 1 black mana, and has 4 power and 6 toughness. Whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, creatures your opponent control get -1 power and toughness until the end of the turn. Printed initially in the Theros block, Doomwake Giant was a powerful threat in the slow mid-range dominant Standard. Considering the prevalence of creature decks and the high density of power enchantments in the format, such as Whip of Erebos, it provided a way to win in combat in mirror matches and outright kill smaller creatures. Any creature whose toughness is reduced to 0 or less, dies in a way that gets around protection or the keyword ability Indestructible. As such, Doomwake Giant proved to be especially effective in Legacy, where a single enchantment would be all it took to remove an otherwise very hard to kill creature like True Name Nemesis. Unlike the standard format that Doomwake Giant was so dominant in, Legacy is not nearly so full of enchantments. It really only sees play in Enchantress decks, since it's the only prevalent deck in Legacy that runs enough enchantments to consistently trigger Doomwake Giant's ability a couple of times a turn. These days, Doomwake Giant is often a sideboard card in these decks, brought in against creature-oriented decks, which, although not a varied use case, is still a common one to this day. Then at number 5 we have Diregraff Colossus, a zombie giant with 2 power and toughness that costs 2 generic and 1 black mana. Diregraff Colossus enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each zombie card in your graveyard. This alone made it an aggressive attacker for the standard zombie deck that existed during Amonkhet Standard. Lord of the Accursed already encouraged the zombie deck of the time to be low to the ground and aggressive via its Lord effect boosting other zombies' power and toughness. In turn, these zombies could then trade up with other creatures in combat, meaning that early turns of combat and interaction would often leave multiple zombies in the graveyard by the time you drew and cast Diregraff Colossus, to give it extra +1/+1 counters. Beyond that, Diregraff Colossus also has a second effect that whenever you cast a zombie spell, you create a tapped zombie token with 2 power and toughness. This allows already aggressive zombie decks to produce even more bodies to get boosted by Lord's effect, or even just to be used as fodder like being tapped to draw with Cryptbreaker. For years after rotation, Diregraff Colossus wouldn't see much competitive play until the rise of Pioneer format. There, mono-black aggro decks would leverage cheap aggressive zombies once more, and with it would bring Diregraff Colossus back to competitive play. Although similar to the old standard lists, these mono-black aggro decks had access to more potent interaction and disruption, and are able to better keep up with contemporary decks. Perhaps with time, Diregraff Colossus will see even more play in other formats with the printing of more playable zombies, but for the time being, it's good enough for the 5th spot on this list. Coming in at number 4, we have Sun Titan. In Magic 11, there was a cycle of giants that all had a mana value of 6, as well as 6 power and toughness, and abilities that worked when the giant entered the battlefield or attacked. Specifically, Sun Titan cost 4 generic and 2 white mana, and also had the keyword ability Vigilance. This means it doesn't tap whenever it attacks. This works well with its ability that whenever Sun Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return a permanent card with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. White very rarely gets reanimation effects, and that was especially true at the time of its printing. As such, it was a powerful mainstay standard deck. Cards such as Nihil Spellbomb and the like were already effective as one-off effects, but when combined with Sun Titan's recursion, allowed slower mid-range and control decks to out-advantage their opponent over the course of the game. This followed into other formats, with Sun Titan being one of the staple high-end threats of blue-white control decks in Modern for years. Various decks use Sun Titan, however, over time its playability has certainly waned. These days, Sun Titan primarily sees play in the Commander format, which, although relevant for a card's impact, doesn't add too much value to its placement on the list. As such, Sun Titan is only 4th on the list. However, 2 other members of the Titan cycle it's from do also feature on this list. They are higher because while Sun Titan was initially quite strong, it has seen far less play in recent years than 2 of its fellow Titans. And at number 3, we have Grave Titan. As a member of the aforementioned Titan cycle, this giant costs 4 generic and 2 black mana, and has 6 power and toughness. Grave Titan also has Death Touch, an ability that means whenever Grave Titan deals any amount of damage to a creature, it is enough to destroy it. Essentially, unless the creature has indestructible or is otherwise protected, Grave Titan will destroy it in combat. Death Touch is already a strong aggressive keyword by itself, but beyond this, whenever Grave Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, it creates 2 zombie tokens with 2 power and toughness. In practice, this means Grave Titan offers you 10 power and toughness split over 3 bodies right when it enters, then provides even more tokens each time it attacks. When the card was initially printed in M11, Grave Titan quickly became the premier control finisher in both extended and standard format. Over the years, Grave Titan remained the top-end threat for many strategies, given its relatively low cost and snowballing potential. While today it's not nearly as prolific, Grave Titan is often played in Legacy Reanimator as one of the go-to targets to bring back with reanimation spells. While not as powerful as Grizzlebrand, it's much easier to cast Grave Titan naturally if you draw it. Thus, while Entomb is still used to bin the primary threats, Grave Titan can sit in the hand to either be discarded and reanimated, or even just cast naturally with the help of Dark Ritual. From there, once the Reanimator player has the Grave Titan, it not only provides heavy pressure on the life total, but also creates chump blockers for any potential return attack from the opponent on their turn. Those tokens can also be used alongside Bone Shards to answer a creature or a planeswalker. While not as ever-present as it once was in other formats, Grave Titan remains present enough in Legacy that it earns its spot here at number 4, especially given its previous dominance for years after its initial printing. Coming in at number 2, we have Bonecrusher Giant. This giant costs 2 colorless and 1 red mana, and has 4 power and 3 toughness. Whenever it's targeted by a spell, Bonecrusher Giant deals 2 damage to the spell's controller. In a vacuum, that is a fairly strong creature with high stats for its mana value, and a decent ability that deters it from being removed by typical means of interaction in most formats. Of course, that's only half the card, since it also has an adventure spell attached to it called Stomp. Stomp costs 1 generic and 1 red mana for an adventure instant that deals 2 damage to any target. This alone is quite good, considering it's effectively a slightly overcosted shock with the upside of being an adventure spell to balance it out. But Stomp also has the added effect of making it so damage cannot be prevented this turn. From the moment it was printed, Bonecrusher Giant overtook Standard. The play of killing an opponent's small creature on turn 2, then casting Bonecrusher Giant as a body on turn 3, proved to be a format-defining move. Creatures with 2 or less toughness were avoided because they died to Bonecrusher Giant, and presented too much of an advantage loss. Combined with already existing adventure support that, as already mentioned, eventually got banned in Standard, Bonecrusher Giant proved to be arguably the strongest card in its Standard format. And in the Pioneer format, it still sees ubiquitous play, given that it's a reasonable removal spell for various relevant creatures in the format, and an aggressive body to boot for red-black aggro decks. Bonecrusher Giant has even seen play in Legacy, specifically in red stompy lists built around controlling prison effects and aggressive creatures to beat down the opponent. Bonecrusher Giant's versatility and strength, both as interaction and as a creature on the board, has allowed it to work its way into multiple formats and onto the second spot on this list. Finally, at number 1, we have Primeval Titan. The last member of the Titan cycle on our list, Primeval Titan costs 4 generic and 2 green mana, and has 6 power and toughness. Like the previous 2 Titans, it also has a keyword ability, in this case Trample. This means any excess damage it deals in combat is dealt to the player directly. While this is good, the real reason Primeval Titan earns the top spot on this list is its other ability. Whenever Primeval Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, you may search your library for up to 2 lands and put them onto the battlefield. While an effect that searches 2 lands onto the battlefield isn't uncommon by any means, it's very rare that this effect allows you to select any lands instead of just basic lands. This instantly allowed for decks that needed to find a specific land to get whatever they wanted, leading to the rise of combo decks based around Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle. These decks wanted as many copies of Valakut on the battlefield as possible, and Primeval Titan could grab 2 copies of it. or if you already had copies of Valakut, it could grab mountains to trigger it. Given just how easily Primeval Titan searches up lands, most decks that run it also run several one-off lands for their effects, such as running Bojuka Bog and sideboards to combat graveyard decks. Even beyond the raw selection ability that comes from this ability, the pure tempo swing that comes with ramping by 2 lands on entry and attack can allow someone to get extremely ahead on mana. The disparity caused by Primeval Titan is so great that the card was even banned in the casual format Commander. From the day it was printed to current day, Primeval Titan has been an effective and powerful card in various formats, such as Cloudpost decks and Legacy. In particular, however, it is the modern format where Primeval Titan has seen the most dominance. Alongside Amulet of Vigor, Primeval Titan can work in conjunction with bounce lands that tap for 2 mana at the cost of entering tapped and bouncing another land back to your hand on entry. This can reset other lands' enter the battlefield abilities, as well as allowing someone to accelerate their mana greatly with Amulet of Vigor untapping these lands. Amulet Titan has been a mainstay in the format for years, and will likely continue to do so. And that's the list. Honorable mentions go to Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger, and Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, 2 giants that arguably could have been on this list given their current viability in various formats, but they've been discussed on the channel frequently in previous videos, and we wanted to highlight other cards instead. Are there any cards you think we missed? If so, go ahead and leave a comment down below. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.